Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have a few more minutes until we start. But if you want to say hello in the chat and just tell us where you're joining us from, that would be great. Welcome in, everybody. All right, we are right at 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Make sure we stay on time. Welcome, everyone, to FLA's Year in Policy 2023 webinar. Today, we'll be hearing from Katie Moss and Craig Anderson about everything we've done in policy so far this year. A few housekeeping notes. If you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat or in the Q&A. Additionally, we will be recording this session so that you can share it or watch it later. So with that, I will pass it over to Craig and we'll go ahead and get started.
All right. Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you to all of you that have joined today, especially given the holidays. Appreciate you taking the time to hear from me and Katie. And so first, I just wanted to give a reminder about FLA's government affairs team. Why are we here? So private forest landowners, like a lot of other people, need representation in Washington because the federal government can have a profound impact on your economic viability for managing or owning private forest land. And so between me and Katie, I oversee a congressional legislative branch, and she oversees the executive and regulatory affairs. And so we are here to represent you and your interest and make sure your voice is heard in Washington, D.C. Because as the old saying goes, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so we are there to make sure we offer not only your story, but also common sense policy solutions. Because while it's easy to complain with the chaos that can happen in Washington, D.C., you also need to give options to policymakers with how to better the situation. So first, I'm going to jump into the legislative branch. And before I really jump into the discussion about legislation and policy that we've been working on and monitoring, I think it's important to give background about both chambers of Congress as well as some of the power players that really shape what the policy could be that we'll be working on. And so first, I want to introduce these four gentlemen, and half of them y'all might already be familiar with, and the other half are fairly new when it comes to the policy world. So we're going to start left to right. And on the left is Hakeem Jeffries. He's a congressman from New York State, Democrat, and the current minority leader of the House. On his right is Mitch McConnell, senator from Kentucky, Republican, and the minority leader of the Senate. To his right is Chuck Schumer, senator from New York, Democrat, and the majority leader of the Senate. And to his right is Mike Johnson, Congressman from Louisiana, Republican, and the Speaker of the House. So let's first talk about the lower chamber, the House of Representatives. So the current makeup, 225 Republicans, 213 Democrats, one vacancy, soon to be two, with Kevin McCarthy resigning at the end of the month. And as I already mentioned, the current leadership makeup with Republicans, with Speaker Mike Johnson, and with Democrats, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. So 2023, to say the least, was a roller coaster of a year for Congress and the House in particular. And the drama began right at the onset with Kevin McCarthy's ascension to Speaker. Took more than 15 rounds of voting, which was unprecedented, and certainly delayed committee assignments in regular order for several weeks. And the routine partisan fighting that normally happens and will delay and doom legislation was exacerbated by intra-party fighting in both parties in the House. This worsened when a deal was struck in the spring by Speaker McCarthy and President Biden to avert any sort of debt limit deal, making sure that we could avoid economic catastrophe was very key to getting that deal across the finish line, yet just worsened relations with some of the members of the Republican Party and their relationship with Speaker McCarthy. The boiling point really came in October when a continuing resolution was passed by Congress to avert a government shutdown. And let me just remind the audience that a continuing resolution, that is just passing the last enacted law levels for appropriations. This is very routine. Almost every year, you will see a short-term CR, but the members of the Republican Party, the 8 that voted with all the Democrats in the House, they pointed to this CR as the reason why they used a very rarely used procedural move to oust McCarthy from the Speaker's office. So this procedural move was known as the motion to vacate. And that happened on October 3rd, mere days after the continuing resolution was passed and the government shutdown was avoided. So after McCarthy was ousted, we had nearly 3 weeks without a speaker in the House. And this halted all activity in the House. Nothing could be done. And there were multiple candidates that threw their hat in the ring. And after 4 different candidates tried on the House floor to become Speaker, it finally ended up with Mike Johnson, who became the Speaker of the House. And so luckily, he got that gavel 3 weeks later, and he's been in the position now for 2 months. And we are now in the position where the House has recessed until January 9th, 2024, and certainly has a lot on the plate for next year. Let's go to the Senate. And Senate also has a very narrow majority, with Democrats ruling it. That includes 3 senators who identify as independents, 49 Republicans. And as we covered previously, the leader of the Senate is Chuck Schumer, and the minority leader is Mitch McConnell. So the House is typically, of the 2 chambers, the much more raucous chamber, just given the nature of its membership and the more partisan leaning members that are elected. But the Senate has not been immune to this chaos either. Even with Senator Schumer being able to maintain a majority in the Senate, he's had 2 different members that have bucked the party quite frequently to join with Republicans on different policy issues or to sink different legislation. You have Senator Kirsten Sinema of Arizona, who became independent several months ago, as well as Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. And both of them, as I said, have joined with Republicans on numerous issues that we can talk about later. Uh, but in addition, we've had Senator Tuberville of Alabama, who really held up a lot of confirmations of Pentagon officials, which was starting to grind a lot of other legislation to a halt, given that those confirmations are generally unopposed by any member and are passed very quickly en masse. And with his holdup, required days and weeks of having to consider these people individually. And further, while the House has censured two different individuals, as well as even removing one member, former Congressman George Santos of New York, the Senate has also had their fair share of drama with the former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, having been indicted, and thus he was stripped of his committee assignments as well as his chair over the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so, on top of that, and I'm painting a very rosy picture, I know, Vice President Kamala Harris has just now broken the record for the most tie-breaking votes. And the last time this record was held was when John C. Calhoun was vice president in 1832. So we're looking at a very tense time politically, but all of that is to say that that forces us to re-examine what we're doing, as well as how we can be helpful with what Congress is working on. So next, let's turn to see what Congress has actually done this year. And given what I've covered with both the House and the Senate, it's no surprise when you look at the column in the left, there were not a lot of bills that were signed into law. Indeed, this Congress is on track to be one of the least productive sessions of Congress in history. And as I said, the partisan fighting and the inter-party fights have delayed and doomed legislation that normally is able to get significant support from both parties. And that includes appropriations measures, the Farm Bill, and even a supplemental spending package that would address our border security with Mexico, as well as aiding countries that we're partners and allies with, including Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine. Now, despite the low number of bills that have been signed into law, there has been success with some legislation in using different strategies to get bills and policy ideas to the forefront of the political world. And one of these is the Congressional Review Act. And as many of you might know, the Congressional Review Act is a very useful tool for the House Republicans as well as Senate Republicans. And what this is it is a way to overturn rulemaking from a federal agency. So if you look in the column on the right, almost a fifth of the bills that have passed both chambers have been Congressional Review Act bills. And in particular, of interest to this group, two of them, one dealt with overturning the EPA's rulemaking on waters of the US, and the other would overturn the US Fish and Wildlife Service's rule on the definition of habitat, as well as the Endangered Species Act listing for the northern long-eared bat. And luckily, both of those did pass with significant bipartisan support. However, both were vetoed. But as I said, it puts organizations like FLA, as well as supporters of making sure that we have common sense policies, in a great position when there is litigation, as well as just continuing the narrative of how we have best management practices. So let's next turn to review what FLA's legislative strategy has been. So this slide is pretty easy to help tee up the next slides, but we're going to review why is DRA our priority. We're going to walk through what our involvement has been with policymakers, I'm going to give a brief outlook for what I see in my crystal ball for 2024. And then I'll also talk about some other policy items that will be of interest to this group. So let's first talk about Disaster Reforestation Act. Some of you have asked, why is Disaster Reforestation Act important? Why do we talk about it? Why is this our number one priority? The way that I see it, there are a ton of great policy items, policy proposals that are great for private forest landowners, great for forestry, great for rural America, great for our country. However, we are in a position where there are growing natural disasters. There's no safety net for landowners. Landowners are in a very unique position where their assets are not an annual crop, and there's far more risk and very little safety net to be able to help mitigate any of those risks and keep the landowners in this business. So what are we doing? To help with this message and to raise the profile of why we need to get this done, we've been growing our co-sponsors in both the House and the Senate. We've grown outside support for this bill, including from organizations in the Southeast, New England, the Great Lakes, Pacific Northwest, and even most recently with the national organizations like the American Farm Bureau Federation. We've also been coordinating with the legislative sponsors in both the House and the Senate on identifying which vehicles should we consider trying to attach this to. Because as we covered in the previous slide, there aren't a lot of bills that make it to the president's desk. So we have to be realistic and we have to be creative when we try to look at ways that we can get this done. So next, let's turn to some of the involvement that we've had. So FLA has been involved in a myriad of ways with our policymakers. In March, we had our fly-in with our board of directors, and we met with members of Congress from 17 state different delegations. We've participated in listening sessions all across the country in Florida, Maine, Minnesota, and Oregon. We've also participated in roundtables with senators where we were the only forestry representative. We've participated in political events. Legislative champions for private forest landowners, while they do not necessarily need support from us, it's good to thank them for standing up and taking the tough votes, making the pitch that private forest landowners are the gold standard for our industry. We've also been doing a lot with membership outreach, both internal and to external audiences, on what our priorities are and how we can partner together to get our policy priorities across the finish line. So let's take a look at what the outlook could be for 2024. I won't sugarcoat it. It could be a very difficult year next year. There's a lot that is building up that Congress has kicked the can down the road, and we're going to look at a much slimmer majority in the House, with both George Santos and Kevin McCarthy giving up their seats. We're going to have government funding fights when they come back immediately. There was a plan that passed a CR with 2 different funding deadlines for federal agencies that will need to be addressed as soon as they get back. We have a supplemental spending package that is continuing to be negotiated in the House and the Senate that would address the southern border as well as our allies and partners abroad. The Farm Bill. In the most recent continuing resolution, the 2018 Farm Bill was extended through next October. And that's something that while the 2018 Farm Bill was a great bill for many in agriculture and rural America, there are always updates that need to be made. And certainly it's no secret that we have worked with our partners in both the House and the Senate to try and include the Disaster Reforestation Act in that bill. Farm Bill is seen as one of those must-pass pieces of legislation, and it could be a vehicle that we could use. In addition, tax extenders. This is always an idea and a proposal towards the end of a session of Congress. And so there are a lot of different tax policies that we will be weighing in on that I will get into in the next slide. And finally, the 2024 election. Not only is it just a routine election for federal officials in both the House and the Senate, but it's also going to be a very contentious election, the presidential election. And so, for those of you that have not read my article in the magazine, I go into this in more detail and give my crystal ball prediction for what could happen in both the House, Senate, and the presidency. So, if you have not already, if you do not subscribe to the magazine, please do so. We'd love for you to read it and would love to get your thoughts on what you think my predictions look like. So now let's jump back to some other policy items that we're going to be looking at. And it's no surprise, but two of these are tax related. The Death Tax Repeal Act is a very important bill, one that has already been introduced in the Senate by Senator John Thune of Iowa, or South Dakota, excuse me, as well as the Preserving Stepped Up Basis. Both bills have significant bipartisan support and are very important to our membership. The Farm Bill was already covered previously, but I wanted to include it again because it has become contentious based on a lot of different factors. And while farm bills can be very tough, they're necessary. It's a very interesting mixture of stakeholders that help get it across the finish line. And our hope is that our involvement and our advocacy for this could not only get it across the finish line, but could potentially include the Disaster Reforestation Act as well. And you'll notice that EU deforestation regulation is here too. While that is more of a foreign policy interest, it's one that's already influencing a lot of domestic policymakers, and one that we will certainly bring up and have on the radar for legislators when we do go to DC and meet with people. It's something that we're already taking strides to address and back up with data from both the association and the foundation side. And lastly, the Congressional Review Act. This was something that I touched on a little bit about bills that would try to reverse rulemaking from agencies like EPA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But we're going to continue to see this being used. It's been a very effective tool and one that we've seen touch many rulemaking. And so while there is ongoing concern with how transatlantic policies could impact domestic ones, I think we will see much more CRAs be introduced, but also have success as well. And so tying into CRA is really the work that we do on the regulatory side, and is a perfect example of how my work overlaps and intertwines with Katie's work as well. So now I will turn it over to Katie to give us more of a picture of what has been happening on the regulatory side this year.
All right, thanks, Craig. So shifting gears to the regulatory world and our work with the federal agencies, I did want to start this discussion just by kind of recapping why we do what we do and what our strategy is in the regulatory environment. So our goal when we're working with these regulations is your freedom of operations through the protection of your private property rights, which are secured through regulatory certainty. So how do we achieve this lofty goal? There are definitely times when it's appropriate to take really hardline stances against actions or regulations from the agencies. And we have certainly done that on issues in the past and will continue to do that when it's necessary. As an example, we currently have an ongoing lawsuit with the Fish and Wildlife Service on their black pine snake critical habitat designation. So, this is not something that we shy away from. But what we are seeing more and more of is that to accomplish our goal of achieving regulatory certainty, we really need to look for opportunities to educate the agencies about private land management and landowner priorities, to be able to reach these resolutions that work with landowners rather than against them. It's a lot easier to create change from the inside. So when we open up lines of communication and build these relationships and trust with the agencies, it gives us a seat at the table to help inform and guide the agencies as they're making these decisions. We've found that oftentimes collaboration at the front end can help us avoid potential conflict on the tail end. And that really allows us to be proactive in a typically reactive regulatory environment. But at the end of the day, our message is always the same, and that's that private landowners provide the nation with clean air, clean water, and healthy wildlife habitat, but they also rely on economic return to keep their land healthy and in forest use. So landowners have to be able to effectively manage their land to keep providing these benefits, and they can't do that in an overly strict or an unpredictable regulatory environment. So if the agencies want landowners to work with them and conserve the resources on their property, they need to be able to provide flexibility and predictability for landowners in the regulations that they're putting out. So a few common themes that we've seen in 2023 under the Biden administration. First is a focus on environmental and social justice. That's, increased consideration for and involvement with underserved and underrepresented communities when the agencies are creating these environmental policies. For example, we've seen a lot of focus on urban forestry. We've seen more of a focus on consulting with tribes, an emphasis on cultural resources and what our nation's natural resources mean to communities, things like that. Also, what we've seen in 2023 is the issues are really being viewed through a climate lens. There's a focus on climate mitigation and climate resiliency. There's an emphasis on how the climate is affecting wildlife and habitat, how climate is affecting wildfire and other threats to our natural resources. And a focus on what practices and what management regimes on forest land are considered climate smart. Forests are also getting a lot more national attention, specifically about how they can be a natural climate solution. So where do private lands fit in with this equation? Is all this attention on private forest land good or bad? This is something that we are continuing to figure out, because there are definitely pros and cons. Landowners are being recognized more and more for their environmental contributions, which is great. But in some cases, private lands are also being looked at under a microscope. So we really have to be careful when we're looking at how forest lands are considered as a natural climate solution. And really, there's been a lot of funding out there in 2023, especially from the Inflation Reduction Act, to support these themes and these objectives on state, tribal, and private lands through different programs or grants or cooperative agreements. And while it's really great that there is so much funding being dedicated to forest-related projects, it has been difficult for the agencies to be able to efficiently get this money out on the ground, mostly due to capacity. So both the Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service are really working hard to add that additional capacity, especially to their regional teams, just to help get this money out and on the ground into these beneficial projects. So when we work in the regulatory space, we are typically working with a handful of agencies that make decisions that can impact landowners. Predominantly Forest Service at the USDA, Fish and Wildlife Service at the Department of Interior, and the Environmental Protection Agency. We also work outside of this beltway on some international policy as well. So I just really wanted to give a quick snapshot of some of the regulatory items that have been on our plate in 2023. So from the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2023, we've seen some good rules and we've seen some not so great rules. On the positive side, we have had proposed regulations to streamline conservation agreements just to make it more simple and easy and cost efficient for landowners to participate in on-the-ground conservation. We've definitely seen more of a general understanding that collaboration is the model to achieve long-lasting conservation success. And we've seen more acknowledgement of the contributions and benefits of working forests in species conservation. And in some cases, more flexibility in regulations for landowners who are implementing forestry best management practices and other silvicultural practices that benefit species. We've especially seen a lot of this in the Southeast. On the not so positive side, we have continued to have rollback of some Trump-era regulations that did provide regulatory certainty for forest landowners, including a final decision to rescind the definition of habitat for the purposes of designating critical habitat. There was also a recent proposal to reinstate the blanket 4D rule, which would basically extend endangered level protections to threatened species unless the service writes a species-specific 4D rule. There was also a final rule allowing the service to introduce experimental populations of a species outside of their historic range, and that just kind of adds an additional layer of regulatory uncertainty for landowners. And then also, we'll always end up with some species proposals that are not exactly looking the way that we would like them to, that are, strict and don't provide as much flexibility for private landowners. Some big examples from this year have been the California spotted owl and the northern long-eared bat. And then to top it off on the species side, the Center for Biological Diversity this year filed a lawsuit against the Fish and Wildlife Service for the service's decision to not list the eastern population segment of the gopher tortoise. So y'all will probably recall we sent a bunch of communications out celebrating this decision by the Fish and Wildlife Service to not list the gopher tortoise, because it was really a result of a huge, unprecedented collaborative effort between private landowners and the service for them to be able to come to this decision and decide that the gopher tortoise did not need to be listed. So it is unfortunate that that challenge, that lawsuit by the Center for Biological Diversity is another thing on our plate in 2023 and will continue to be on our plate in 2024. From the Forest Service, our big regulatory item of interest was their old growth initiative, which we've really talked about in length since it was first announced on Earth Day in 2021. So it's been around for a little while, but there have been a lot of developments in 2023, including an inventory of old growth and mature forests on federal lands, and an announcement just yesterday that President Biden has tasked the service with amending all 128 national forest management plans to protect and conserve old growth. And then, also with the Forest Service, there's been general discussions around topics such as wildfire and reforestation. Big items from the EPA, Waters of the U.S., that final rule was released in December of 2022, but we did get some beneficial amendments to that rule following the Sackett versus EPA Supreme Court case earlier this year. And then there was also from the EPA a proposal to revise the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for particulate matter by lowering that threshold, which can pose issues for folks that are using prescribed fire on their property. And then, of course, we have the international issues, protocols for the measurement and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, treatment of woody biomass in overseas markets, the European Union deforestation regulations requiring geolocations on wood products that are being imported into the EU. So there is obviously a lot happening in the regulatory world. So how is FLA staying engaged? How are we implementing our engagement strategy to make a difference on some of these regulations? So as I said before, our strategy is really to build relationships with regulatory agencies, educate them on landowner contributions and needs, and really just provide the private landowner perspective to help inform regulations. So how do we do this? How have we done this in 2023? First is Timber Talks and Forest Forums. These are events that allow us to spend time directly with regulatory agency leadership, either in the woods or around the table, just to share the private landowner priorities, open up lines of communication, build relationships, and really look for opportunities to work proactively together to address issues. We had 2 timber talks this year with a focus on informing leaders and partners in the regulatory space about what our landowners do. And we also had a forest forum back in August with Southeast regional leadership of the Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And on top of that, we met with the Fish and Wildlife Service leadership in DC back in the spring as part of our Forest Policy Institute. So there's been a lot of engagement on that front. We also like to focus on partnerships and working together to really broaden our reach on issues and amplify the voice of the broader forestry community. So our CEO, Scott Jones, serves on the International Sustainable Biomass Standards Committee. We've joined industry letters about domestic and international forestry issues. We are a member of the Wildlife Conservation Initiative. We also attend events that are hosted by our partners in the forest and the conservation community, really just to give us the opportunity to share the private landowner message with a broader audience and learn about what others are doing in this space and really position us to be a proactive partner and a go-to resource. And then there's sharing our perspective. So this is being done at these meetings and events, but we also share our perspective and the private landowner perspective through Federal Register comments to the agencies and letters to agency leadership. We've even helped craft letters to the European Union. So we are making sure that the private landowner perspective and your interests as private landowners are being shared and messaged far and wide. We also have species status assessments and other species issues and proposals. So this is where we really work to help inform species decisions to preclude the need to list them or position private landowners appropriately in the regulations so that you all have the flexibility that you need to carry out the operations on your forest land. We saw a lot of success when we worked on the species status assessment for the gopher tortoise. And in 2023, we served on the Species Status Assessment Committee for the Eastern Diamondback rattlesnake. We also have ongoing efforts to get forestry best management practices included as take exceptions in all aquatic species listings. We also have ongoing efforts with these multi-state, we call them mega listings, the northern long-eared bat is an example, just to make sure that any regulations or landowner guidance really keeps private landowner needs in mind across the country. So we're continuing to use multiple outlets to inform the agencies and share private landowner priorities. And then we have hiring panels, which is a relatively new and sort of different way to look at collaboration. But really thanks to our increased communication and relationship building with the Fish and Wildlife Service, I was asked to serve on 2 different hiring panels to help the Fish and Wildlife Service fill some internal positions that will be working with landowners and other forestry organizations. So last year I was on a hiring panel for their ESA Section 10 coordinator position, and most recently a Southeast grant specialist position. So really serving on these panels is something that's typically reserved for internal personnel, but the increased communication and partnership between the service and FLA has encouraged them to sort of open up this process so that they have input from an outside landowner entity. They are really taking steps to employ someone that landowners can connect with and trust. And I've had the opportunity to help guide that decision. So that's really a prime example of how our relationship building with the service helps us be proactive in the regulatory space. So looking ahead to 2024, in 2024, we will still be under the Biden administration and we'll continue seeing consistent themes ahead of the 2024 elections, especially the emphasis on climate and the emphasis on environmental justice, both of which will likely be ramped up ahead of the 2024 presidential elections. But we will continue pushing forward with our strategy, building these relationships that allow us to be proactive, educating policymakers on the benefits and good stewardship of private working forest land, and the needs of our landowners, and just being a resource for the private landowner perspective. Just really making sure that the agencies understand the contributions of private working forest land and why landowners need regulatory certainty and flexibility to operate, and also why landowners need strong wood markets to continue being able to operate and provide clean air, clean water, and healthy wildlife habitat. So a few specific items. We know that old growth is still on the regulatory agenda. We know that there are some multi-state listings that are on the horizon. There are some more bat species and monarch butterflies on the horizon as well. EU regulations, as the implementation of those regulations proceeds into the new year, we will continue to have that on our agenda to tackle, and other international forestry issues. These things aren't going away, so we will continue finding ways to better position private landowners in those regulations and in legislation on the Hill. So we've talked about the legislative work and the regulatory work, but really what we found to be the key behind our success is you, the landowner, the forest stakeholder, and the story that you have to tell. Policymakers, both in Congress and in the agencies, they really need to hear from you about how you manage and utilize your resources and how these policies or regulations impact you. So our Set to Go program provides our members with simple, easy, and effective ways to engage with policymakers, and really puts us in a position to advance landowner priorities when the opportunities arise. So right now we have 11 active teams that encompass 20 states across the nation. We also have 3 more teams that are in a formation period right now, and we want to form even more teams. So in total, we have around 175 engagement team members that are part of our Set to Go program. And these members are receiving monthly or bi-monthly emails that provide really a more in-depth look at FLA's policy and regulatory actions, as well as opportunities to engage with their members of Congress or with the federal agencies. So just a snapshot, over the past year, our Set to Go team members were encouraged to reach out to their members of Congress during August recess about DRA, attend Farm Bill listening sessions and speak at these Farm Bill listening sessions, and engage with their state forestry associations about DRA. We've also, on this front, launched a new grassroots engagement webpage, and we recently, back in August, hosted a landowner learning webinar that really highlights the importance of grassroots engagement and shows some of the success of our Set to Go teams. So I encourage you, if you aren't already, please consider joining a state engagement team. We really want to share our work with you, and we want to hear directly from you about what your biggest regulatory and legislative concerns are in the new year. And if you're already on a team, when you get those messages and those outreach opportunities, feel free to send them to other people and encourage them to get involved. We are always looking to grow our existing teams and add new teams, and we would love to facilitate you being able to share your story with policymakers to help influence policy in the future.
So this slide is a really good way of showing just how our Set to Go teams have been involved when it comes to pushing policy. So this map probably looks very similar to the last map, and there's a reason for that, because of our membership and how engaged all of you are with helping push for common sense policy solutions, but also for advocating and working with us and sharing your story. So this map is representation of support that we have for the Disaster Reforestation Act. And if you look, the states that are yellow either have a member of the House or a state association that's supportive of the Disaster Reforestation Act. States that are blue have both, and then states that are green have both of those and a senator that is a sponsor or a co-sponsor of the Disaster Reforestation Act. Our goal is to make all of these states green, and we can do it with more engagement from our members and continued growth with our state engagement teams. And so this is a challenge. If you're on this or you're watching this webinar and you see your state is yellow, blue, or gray, contact us. We want to make it green. And together, we'll be able to get DRA across the finish line, as well as elevate your voice and your principles with our policymakers in Washington, D.C. So just wanted to end on that note. There's certainly much more for us to do, but we've come a long way. And together, we'll get it done. So this time, there are any questions, please submit them in the chat, and me and Katie would be more than happy to field them.
I just want to say
And
great job to both of you. That it's so much information to take in a short amount of time. And I think you did a great job really explaining everything that you both have worked on this year.
and I encourage anyone, if you don't have a question on the top of your head, but you're thinking about it after we all get off this webinar and you're like, man, I should have asked this. Feel free to email Craig or I, and we will do our best to answer your questions.
We just had somebody else that said you did an amazing job as well. Yep, and that just keeps coming. You guys are doing stuff, and I get to communicate about it, which is great.
We love compliments too. That also
do.
works.
And I'll say, y'all, private forest landowners, y'all are a great group of people to work for. Y'all have an amazing story that is just any opportunity that we get to share it, we love it. So thank you for making our jobs enjoyable.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Katie hit the nail on the head, and jinx with Michelle for saying the same word. But we truly are lucky to be able to work with all of you. It's very rare that people that are in government affairs are able to go to sleep at night knowing what they are presenting and who they're representing. But we represent some of the greatest people in this country who will make this country great. And certainly want to keep doing that. And it's thanks to you and your input and your work with us that is going to make our industry sustainable for years to come and generations to come.
Absolutely. Julia had a great question. Is there a time in 2024 when FLA is planning a tentative Hill visit?
That is a fantastic question. So certainly I go up to DC on an as needed basis, but we will have our board of directors flying in with our Foreign Policy Institute students as well in February. It will be February 6th through 8th. And it's very exciting. We've already had a very large number of our board of directors RSVP for it. But I'm honestly and selfishly most excited about our Foreign Policy Institute student, or Forest Policy Institute students, apologies for that, has really grown to include universities from all over the country. So this year, we've included students that will include Oregon State University, Michigan State University, Louisiana Tech University, Mississippi State University, Stephen F. Austin State University, and the University of Florida. And so that just creates an even bigger number of members that we are able to engage with and share your story, as well as just helping mentor up and coming experts in the field who are going to help us make sure that you'll continue to be successful down the road. Great question.
And I just want to echo a little bit Craig said with the Forest Policy Institute. That is one of our great foundation programs. So if you're not familiar with our foundation, reach out to us. We'd be happy to explain exactly what we do. But one of the three pillars is really developing that future of forestry. And that's where that Forest Policy Institute comes in. So 12 students this year is amazing. Last year was amazing as well. We had 7 students. So I'm glad to see that grow and can't wait to see what they learn this year and all the the great things that they end up doing. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And again, thank you, Craig and Katie, for the wonderful information. I hope everybody has some happy holidays. And I might be the only one thinking about it, but maybe some more snow. Maybe not to some of you in the South, but I wouldn't mind just a little bit of snow over the next few weeks. So thank you, everybody. Yes, and we'll see you next time.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Bye, all. Thank you.